Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson comes from Unit 2, Constitutional History, and is Lesson 1 about constitutionalism. In this lesson, you'll learn what a constitution is. You'll learn what a constitution does. You'll learn what is constitutionalism, and you'll learn who is sovereign in a constitutional system. Let's begin with the question of what is a constitution. Now, the most obvious potential answer to that is that it is a document that does certain things that we'll talk about in a moment. And that's usually the case, at least in the modern world, that a constitution is a written document, but not always. It could be a set of governing traditions for a society. In England, they claim to have a constitution, but it's not a single document. It's a collection of documents and traditions that they believe govern their political society. Here in the United States of America, our country as a whole is governed by a single document, the United States Constitution. And that's the way it usually is in modern times, that there's a single document that we refer to as a constitution. Our next question is, what does a constitution do? And we're going to talk about four things that a constitution does. Four things that it sets, as I put here, for our society. The first of the things that a constitution does can be seen in this collection of three pictures. To the upper left is the White House. The bottom center is the United States Capitol building, where the United States Congress sits. And to the upper right is the United States Supreme Court building. These are the three branches of the United States national government. These are the structures of the government of the United States of America. And that's the first thing that a constitution does, is it sets up government structures, the units of government where governance will take place. So we can add that to our list of four things that the Constitution sets. First of all, it sets up government structures. The next item can be seen in this series of pictures. To the upper left, we have American soldiers after winning a battle. Bottom center, we have the printing of money. In the upper right, we have a mail carrier. These pictures illustrate what government does, or in other words, the functions of government. This is another thing that a constitution can lay out. It can describe the structures in which government decisions are made, and it can also set the purposes for government, the things that it's supposed to be doing with the power given to it. So that's the second of our items that a constitution sets. It sets the functions for government. In this third set of pictures, we see, to the upper left, Congress voting on whether or not to pass a law. At the bottom center, we see the President of the United States signing a proposed law into law. And we see at the upper right a jury trial. Now, from these pictures, we can see the processes of government. In other words, how it goes about doing the things that it's supposed to do. So our first item was the structures of government, where government decisions would take place. Our second item was the things that the government's supposed to be doing. And this third item is how it goes about doing those things. So, for example, in the second slide, where it had the printing of money, well, the decisions about whether or not to print money, what denominations, things like that, would be made by Congress passing a law and the President signing it into law. So those are examples of the processes by which government carries out its decisions. So then that is our third thing that the Constitution does. It sets up the processes by which the government will act. The fourth thing that a constitution can do can be seen in this set of pictures. To the upper left, we have a person being tortured. In the bottom center, we have political protesters being hosed down with a fire hose to prevent them from engaging in their protests. In the upper right, we have police officers beginning to break down the door of a building to conduct a search. Now, what these pictures illustrate are things that we may not want our government to be engaged in. And a constitution allows us to prevent the government from engaging in such things by allowing the setting of limits on government. In other words, putting things outside the government's power. So that provides the fourth thing that a constitution does, is it sets limits on the power that government possesses. Matter of fact, that setting of limits on the power of government is the most important aspect of a constitution. Because without setting limits on the government, unless it is said that there are certain things that the government isn't allowed to do, then those other features of the Constitution become meaningless. Because if the government has no limit on its power, it can in fact choose to change its own structures. If the government has no limits on its power, it could change its own functions. In other words, the government could be set up to do certain things, and it simply could choose to do other things instead. And finally, if its government's power are not limited, it could change its own processes. So when it's set up, it may be decided that it should go through a series of steps in order to create a law, and it can simply bypass those steps and create a law a different way if it wants, if its powers are not limited. So the most important feature of a constitution is that the Constitution tells the government there are things you are not allowed to do. That feature is so important that in this wonderful quote from Thomas Paine, who was a political essayist around the time of the American Revolution, who helped inspire the American Revolution by writing a pamphlet called Common Sense that helped motivate people to try to gain their independence in the colonies here in America. This wonderful political essayist, in a different essay, provided us with this quote, which is very instructive. He says that if a government can alter itself and change itself, there is no constitution. Now think about what's so profoundly important about that. If a government can change its own functions, its own processes, its own structures, it can even change its own limits, then there is no purpose in setting up a constitution that provides limits, provides structures, provides processes, provides functions. The government will simply choose to do something other than those who created it assigned it to do. So the very important feature of a constitution, where it sets rules or boundaries for that government, it sets things where its power is not supposed to operate, becomes meaningless if the government is allowed to step beyond those boundaries that were laid down for it. The government becomes a power unto itself, which is going to have even more profound implications as we go on here in just a moment. Now, the very notion that the powers of government can be limited is what the term constitutionalism means. If you believe in constitutionalism, then you believe that government power can be held in place, that it can be stopped from doing certain things. This is a relatively new concept in human history. Back ages ago, the rule of government was done primarily by kings who claimed that they could do anything by their own force of will. If they wanted to do something, they could. Anything. There were no boundaries to their power. But modern constitutional theory says, yes, there are boundaries to the power of government. Now, once you accept that this idea that there are limits that can be placed on government power, then the next question should be, who sets those limits? Who decides what the government can and can't do? Well, it obviously can't be somebody in the government itself, otherwise we violate the thing that Thomas Paine brought about, that a government can't alter itself, otherwise there is no constitution. The limitations have to come from outside the government. And who is it outside the government that can set limits? Well, in our system of government, here in the United States of America, it is we the people. We the people limit our government. So this is an important feature of a constitution. The Constitution limits the power of government, and therefore there has to be someone outside the government to set those limits. And in our system of government, those who are setting the limits are we the people. Therefore, Constitutionalism, this idea that the powers of government can be limited, presupposes a notion we talked about previously, popular sovereignty. So in order to limit the powers of the government through a constitution, you have to have popular sovereignty. The people are in charge, they create a government, and then they use their power as the ultimate sovereigns to tell that government that they created that it may not do certain things. And if that government ever steps beyond those boundaries that the people have laid down for it, the government becomes illegitimate, and the people then, as we've discussed previously in this course, have the authority to tear it down and replace it if they see fit. Okay, so now let's review what we learned about constitutionalism in this lesson. Let's begin with the question, what does a constitution do? Does it set government structures? Does it set government functions? Does it set government processes? Or does it set government limits? Well, that's a trick question because it does all four of those. Those are the four things that a constitution does. But perhaps the more important question is, which of those is the critical feature of a constitution? Is it setting government structures, setting government functions, setting government processes, or setting government limits? Well, as I spent the last few minutes talking about, and it should be clear to you, the most important feature of a constitution is it sets government limits. All the other things that it does become meaningless if it cannot put boundaries on the government and tell it that there's certain things it's not allowed to do. So then that leads us to the question, what is constitutionalism? Is it the notion that government can be limited? Or is it the idea that the government is sovereign? Or is it merely the study of constitutions? Or is it the notion that government requires a constitution? Now think about that for a moment. Which is the right answer? Now, you might be mistakenly tempted to pick the fourth one, that government requires a constitution. No, it doesn't. Kings who had absolute power and claimed a divine right from God to do anything they wanted were still governments. So you don't have to have a constitution to have a government. But if you're going to have constitutionalism, then you must accept the idea that governments can be limited. So that's the correct answer. That's what constitutionalism is. So our next question is, under a constitution then, where a government is limited, who's in charge? Who's the sovereign? Is it the monarch? Is it the parliament? Or a Congress, some representative body? Or is it the people? Or is it no one? Well, it needs to be someone from outside the government